that there's nothing left, there's no solution left, everything has been exhausted, then he makes a dua and says, رَبِّ انظِرْنِي إِلَى يَوْمِ يُبْعَثُونَ, that, Ya Allah, let me live until the day of judgment. So he turns to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala when all the other doors are closed. So what's the difference over here? Is that Adam alayhi salam had a connection with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala where he's always making dua, but Iblis just made it this once. And when Adam alayhi salam came to earth, he continued to engage in this worship while Iblis alayhi salam went the other way, right? So he made this one dua for his own self-needs. We'll talk about the content of dua later. But he made this one dua because he realized he had no other options, he had no other solutions left. So the sign of a person who has good iman, who is a good believer, is that number one, that the dua is their first solution, right? They're constantly engaged in this moment of dua, that even when you have other solutions, I'm not saying to ignore all the other solutions, but that the first thing you turn to is Allah, right? You put your trust in Allah, you ask Allah to help you with whatever task you're about to do, you ask Allah to forgive you if you just made a mistake, you ask Allah for whatever it is, and then you go to all the other avenues and all the other options, right? You don't save dua for when you've exhausted all your other methods, right? Dua should be the first thing you go to. And it should not only be the first thing you go to, it should be the constant thing you do. And I don't want you guys to think of this like you're asking someone. You have to realize that there's a huge difference between asking someone for something and asking Allah for something. And we'll talk more about this in detail. But what I mean over here is that when you keep asking, imagine like you have a friend that you're always asking favors for, like, hey, can you pick me up from the airport? Can you help me with my homework? Can you cook me a meal? Whatever it is. Eventually you're going to feel like, oh, I'm annoying my friend, I'm asking them too much. And your friend might even get annoyed too, because you keep on asking them for things constantly and constantly. But it's the opposite when it comes to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, where the more you ask Allah, the more Allah loves you, right? So asking Allah is something that Allah actually wants. وَإِذَا سَأَلَكَ عِبَادِي عَنِّي فَإِنِّي قَرِيبٌ, that if someone asks about me, I am nearby. So Allah wants us to make dua. So making dua is a sign of iman, and it's also a sign of lack of arrogance, that you're humble enough to go to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and to ask Him. The Prophet Muhammad says that Allah gets angry at the person who does not make dua. Why? Because it shows arrogance, that, oh, you're beyond that, or you're bigger than that, or you feel like you need Allah all the time, but when you're not making dua, you feel like you don't need Allah in that moment, so you don't go to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So that's number one, is that that's our first solution, and it's something we constantly do. Number two is that there's two types of du'as, right? You have the spiritual du'a and you have the worldly du'a. And I want to emphasize over here is that we've been conditioned to think that worldly du'as are not good, or not as good as du'as, spiritual du'as or du'as for the hereafter. And I want you guys to understand that it is emphasized even in the Quran that we can make du'a for both. Right? Where does the harm come is that when all your du'as are consistently only asking for worldly things, right? Where you stop asking for things to do with, where you forget about Jannah, you forget about ajr, you forget about like Allah's pleasure. All you do is ask for more money, this job, this marriage, whatever it is, that, you know, your spiritual du'a is an afterthought. Right? So make sure you find a balance in both. In the Quran it says, فَمِنَ النَّاسِ مَن يَقُولُ رَبَّنَا آتِنَا فِي الدُّنْيَا وَمَا لَهُ فِي الْآخِرَةِ مِنْ خَلَاقٍ. That there's some people who ask for the world and they don't care about the akhirah, the hereafter. But then there's other people that say, and the dua that we say all the time, رَبَّنَا آتِنَا فِي الدُّنْيا حَسَنَةً وَفِي الْآخِرَةِ حَسَنَةً وَقِنَا عَذَابَ النَّارِ. This dua is the perfect balance of both. We're asking for good in this world, and we're asking for good in the akhirah. So yes, you should ask for things in the hereafter, but you can also ask for things in this world, and you're recommended to do both. Just make some sort of balance between both. And you can balance that by making your dua like half-half, right? Where you're saying, Ya Allah, give me blessings in my work, but also, Ya Allah, give me Jannah. Or you can make them kind of related. So, Ya Allah, give me blessings in my work so that I may use that to go to Jannah, right? So try to think about, just like we live our whole lives trying to, trying to get good in both this world and the hereafter, our dua should represent that. Number three is that anyone can make dua. So realize over here that even shaitan made dua to Allah, right? So even the worst of all creations realize that the only one who can give him what he needs is Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And if Allah answered the dua of Iblis, who are we to think that Allah won't accept our dua? Right? I want us to think about that. that how foolish is it for us to turn to someone other than Allah, or to think that Allah can't give us, or not can't give us, to not feel like we should ask Allah for what we need, when even the worst of all creations did that. Okay? Number 4 is another lesson over here, is that, what did I write? I think I missed it. Oh yeah. So that over here, we realize that even in a situation of desperation, even shaitan remembered Allah. So what does this tell you? That it's very easy to turn to Allah when things are difficult, right? Iblis did it, the mushrikeen did it, the pagans did it. Everyone bad and everyone good has that instinct to turn to Allah. Even the people around us, the non-Muslims around us, we see them, kind of turn to prayer whenever they have no other choice. In the Quran it tells us, فَإِذَا رَكِبُوا فِي الْفُلْكِ دَعُوا اللَّهَ مُخْلِصِينَ لَهُ الدِّينَ. Or another ayah, وَإِذَا مَسَّكُمُ الضُّرُّ فِي الْبَحْرِ ضَلَّ مَنْ تَدْعُونَ إِلَّا إِيَّاهُ فَلَمَّا نَجَّاكُمْ إِلَى الْبَرِّ أَعْرَضْتُمْ. Which means that these people, when they would be on their ships, and then their ships would start to sink, or they'd start to fear for their lives, they'd turn to Allah. And as soon as Allah saved them, they'd forget Allah, right? So when shaitan needed Allah in that time of desperation, he turned to Allah and then he turned away from him. So what does this tell you? That you need to, it is the human nature to turn to Allah in terms of crisis, but the Muslim, the good mu'min, turns to Allah even when things are easy. Even when things are easy, even when you're getting what you need, you still turn to Allah and make dua that Allah blesses you with what He's giving you. You make dua that Allah makes you from those who are grateful. You make dua that Allah is pleased with you, that He gives you Jannah. Whatever it is, that whenever you have what you think you need, there's always more. And you still turn to Allah in those moments. The Prophet Muhammad ﷺ says, مَنْ سَرَّهُ أَنْ يَسْتَجِيبَ اللَّهُ لَهُ عِنْدَ الشَّدَائِدِ. That whoever wants his du'as to be accepted in times of distress, in times of hardship, right? فَلْيَكْثُرُ الدُّعَاء فِي الرَّخَاءِ. Let him increase his dua in times of ease. So if you want that guarantee that when things are bad, Allah will help you and save you from those moments that are bad, that when things are hard, when you're going to face the difficulties in life that everyone faces difficulties in life. And if you're living a comfortable life right now, you'll face it later, right? And even if you're facing it right now, you'll continue to face it because that's what life is. If you want a guarantee that Allah will be there for you when things are hard, you need to turn to Allah when things are easy, right? There's a kind of like a saying by some scholars that say that there's 3 levels of patience. We can apply this to dua also. The easiest level of patience is when things are hard, right? Because that's when you have no choice but to turn to Allah. Something bad happens, you lose something, you can't turn to anyone but Allah. Now the harder level is when things are easy, because in that moment it's easy to forget that you need to turn to Allah, right? In that moment when you feel like you're comfortable, that's when you need to be trained to turn to Allah when things are easy. So know Allah in times of ease, and Allah will know you in times of difficulty. Number 5 is that there are no limits when it comes to dua. And no limits is not just that there's no limits in how big a dua can be, but there's also no limits in how small a dua can be, right? I have a dua that I like to make whenever I'm reading my car dua. I ask Allah, always let me be in the fastest lane, right? Like it's become instinct at this point. It's a really silly dua if you think about it, but in the end, if Allah can do it for me, why not? If Allah can give you what you're asking for, why not just ask for it? So there's a hadith that says, where's the hadith? Oh yeah, this hadith that says, قال رسول الله صلى الله عليه وسلم لا يسأل أحدكم ربه حاجته كلها. That let one of you ask Allah for his needs, all of them, even for a shoestring when it breaks. So if your lace on your sneaker breaks, even make dua for that. And that's the hadith is saying that explicitly. That it's something that small, something so tiny. You have like a hole in your shirt or something like that. Whatever it is, your instinct should be in that moment, you make dua. That, Ya Allah, replace this for me. And then you go, you fix it, you replace it, whatever you do. But you're asking Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to help you with something so small. Now when it comes to things that are bigger, what dua did Iblis make to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala? He made a dua that he was given something that no one else was given. For basically near immortality, right? He was given the longest lifespan of any creature. And he's the worst of all creations. So when you make your du'as, make them magnificent, don't think of your own physical limitations when you're making dua. Make them realistic, but make them magnificent. I'm not asking you to make dua right now for the ability to turn invisible tomorrow, right? We want to make our du'as realistic. But you can't make dua, Allah makes you into a millionaire tomorrow, right? Because it's something realistic. You don't know how it's going to happen. Realistic as in by the standards of this world. We're talking about things that are in the sunnah of Allah, things that are natural, not abnormal in nature, right? But even if they don't seem possible to you, nothing's impossible for Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So don't be shy to ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala for something extremely big. Because realize when you ask for something kabir, Allahu Akbar, right? Allah is bigger than whatever you ask for. And when you ask for something that's a lot, Allahu Akthar, Allah is more than whatever you ask for. There's a hadith where the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ tells us that there's no Muslim who calls upon Allah within which no sin or cutting family ties, as in you're not asking for something haram, right? Your du'as have to be asking for something halal, that Allah will give them one of three answers, and we'll talk about this later. And then the Sahaba replied and said, in that case we will ask for more, إِذَا نُكْثِرْ. And then Prophet Muhammad ﷺ replies, Allahu Akthar, Allah has even more. So you think you're asking for more and more and more, but whatever Allah has is more than whatever you can ever ask for, right? So never let limitations of your mind or limitations of how you think, never let that be a limitation in the kind of dua that you make, because it's arrogant to think that a request that you can make is too much for Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, right? So your requests should be as big as possible. There's a hadith Qudsi where Allah says, the Prophet says that Allah says that if every single creation in this world asked Allah for something, Allah's kingdom would not be lessened even by basically even by a drop. It's like it's basically if someone takes a drop of water out of the ocean and how the ocean still stays the same amount, Allah's kingdom would not be lessened by anything, no matter how big or no matter how small it is. So realize, don't put limits in your dua, and this does not mean big limits. Don't even put small limits in your dua. Make dua for the silliest things, no matter how silly it seems to you, because you're still doing an act of worship in that moment and you're asking Allah for something. And number 6, this is not over here, but I added it, which is call Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala by His names. And we'll talk more about this in this step-by-step we're going to go through. But we know that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, وَلِلَّهِ الْأَسْمَاءِ الْحُسْنَى فَادْعُوهُ بِهَا. That Allah has His names, so you should ask Him by His names. And just like Adam alayhi salam called Allah, he said, Rabbana. The greatest of all names is Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala's name, which is Rabb, Rabbana, our Lord. You ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala by these names. And what you need to try to do is, as you learn the names of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, this is something I think we should all do. Maybe we can, one day do a series on this. We should all memorize Allah's names. And when you memorize Allah's names and the meanings to them, then you can ask Allah something relating to the name that you're asked. You can relate the name of Allah to what you're asking, right? So for example, if you're asking Allah for more wealth, you can say Ya Ghani, because Allah is the wealthiest of all. So you call Allah by Al Ghani. If you're asking Allah for forgiveness, you say Ya Ghafur, right? If you're asking Allah for kindness and something, you can say Ya Latif. Whatever it is, there are multiple names that you can go to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to ask Him by those names. And we'll talk more about this. So this is the story of Adam alayhi salam and how we take examples of how to make dua from the story. Now the next step is the question of, will Allah accept my dua? And realize that every single time you make a dua, no matter what that dua is, as long as, again, the main thing is that you're asking for something halal, right? You can't ask Allah to you wake up and you find a stash of alcohol in your cabinet or something. It has to be something halal. As long as you're asking Allah for something halal, there's one of three things are going to happen, right? Either the answer is yes, and Allah gives you what you asked for, right? So you ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala for a job, and that job accepts you the next day or something. Or the answer is yes, but not right now. The timing isn't right. Right, so Allah will accept your dua, but at a later time. So you ask Allah to give you a good marriage, and you don't get married immediately, but maybe 2-3 years later you get a really good marriage. And that's because Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has the bigger picture, right? That better plan for you. So the marriage doesn't work out then, it works out 2-3 years later. Or Allah gives you something better instead. So you ask Allah for a job, and Allah gives you a different job that's better. You ask Allah for a person, and Allah replaces that person with someone better. You ask Allah for so-and-so opportunity, you get a different opportunity. Whatever it is, Or Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala replaces that thing that you're asking for is not right for you, and Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala replaces that with better ajr on the Day of Judgment. So there's no such thing as a no, right? Not a no full stop. It could be no because in that time it's not right for you, or that specific thing is not right for you. But every single dua has a positive response to it. Now this is very easy to say, and in that moment you think what you're asking for is the right thing. But again, it comes with trust in Allah. And we talked about trust in Allah before when we talked about the story of Musa and Khidr. And we said in those moments people are making dua, and Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is saving it for something better. And we see examples of how things are being saved for something better. Right? When those two orphans, their wealth wasn't being found. But because at that moment Allah knew they couldn't protect that wealth for themselves. This is from the story of Musa and Khidr. So whatever it is, whatever you think is right for you, you ask Allah for it, and then obviously you do your work, you do your job. You don't just, ask for a job and not apply for it. You have to do your part also. When you do that, then you have to put your trust in Allah that the answer is going to be what's appropriate for you. Because you've done your job in that moment. You put your trust in Allah, you made dua, and you did what was in your control and what was in your hands, and you leave the rest to Allah. The greatest factor in this is sincerity. Right? And that sincerity comes with trust in Allah, that comes with absolute belief that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala will listen to you, will accept your dua. So you have to do dua with this yaqeen. Idu Allah wa antum muqinuna lil ijaba, that you make dua to Allah and you are sure that you will be answered. Now you don't know exactly how you will be answered, but you are sure that you will be answered. So there's no dua that Allah does not accept. But sometimes the response might be different from what we expect, and you have to think about other plans that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala might have in that moment for you. Allah says, "Ad'uni astajib lakum," that make dua to me and I will answer you, I will reply to you. So realize that when you make dua, that there's no such thing as a negative answer. It's always a positive answer. Go to the next slide. Okay. So what happens when we feel like our dua is not being accepted, right? Let's say we're having this doubt. Is Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala not accepting my dua because, I did something wrong? Is Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala not pleased with me? What am I doing wrong in this moment? And I need everyone to understand that your dua not being accepted does not show that Allah is not happy with you. And who can give me a very clear example of this from the Quran? Yes, Prophet Nuh. Who said that? Oh yeah, Prophet Nuh alayhi salam. He lived for how many? Multiple centuries. He made dua for multiple centuries. And do you not think in this time he was making dua for his family also? And in the end, what happened? Did his son accept Islam? Did his wife accept Islam? In the end, Nuh alayhi salam was better than any of us in this room. And in the end, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala did not accept his dua. Yaqub alayhi salam was making dua to get Yusuf back. Did his dua be accepted immediately? Was when Yaqub made dua to have Yusuf back, did Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala immediately send Yusuf back? No, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala was making Yusuf a king in that time while Yaqub alayhi salam was making dua for him. Right? So even the best of people's dua, Ayyub alayhi salam made dua for decades for his illness to be cured, and it wasn't answered immediately. The Prophet Muhammad ﷺ made dua for the people he loved to be guided, for his uncles to be guided. And Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala told him, إِنَّكَ لَا تَهْدِي مَنْ أَحْبَبْتَ. You won't be able to guide who you love. Right? So in the end, if our dua is not being accepted, it is never an indication that Allah is not pleased with us. It can be an indication that we didn't ask for the right thing maybe, or that we're not getting that thing we asked for in that moment. But it's never an indication that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is not pleased with us. Allah is telling us over and over again about the du'as of the prophets in the Quran, the du'as of Yaqub and Nuh and the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam. And Yaqub alayhi salam, to go back to his example, his eyes went basically nearly blind from how much he cried and his cries for his sons to come back. And I told you what was happening. Why was Allah not accepting his dua in that moment? Because Allah was giving his son better things in that moment. Right? He was building him up for something bigger and greater than Yaqub alayhi salam's dua in that moment. So we always ask ourselves, what did I do to deserve this? Why is Allah not accepting my dua? Why do I have to go through these difficulties? And we have to think about, what did Yusuf do as a child to deserve what he went through? What did Yusuf do as an adult to go to prison? In the end, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala's plan is bigger than ours, and His picture is bigger than ours. And Allah says, Wallahu ghalibun ala amri, that Allah is overlooking all of our affairs. So when our dua is not being accepted, it's because Allah is planning something bigger and better for us. And if you had that yaqeen, that trust when you originally make the dua, then it should be consistent. That yaqeen should stay consistent even when the dua does not be seeming to get accepted in that moment. Now, what's the difference between a request and a dua? So we should not confuse a dua we should not translate in our heads a dua to be a request, a talab, right? In Arabic, talab means request. We have to understand that asking Allah is very different from asking any other human being, not just because of the limitations of humans, but because dua is the primary way in which we connect to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Even in our prayers, we're making dua. Right? Because dua is not always asking for something. Dua is also praising Allah. When we say subhanallah, when we say alhamdulillah, that's considered dua also, because we're praising Allah. So dua is the primary way that we connect with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, not the primary way that we get everything we ask for. Does that make sense? So dua is more than just getting what we ask for. Dua is what makes our religion more unique than any other religion. And what makes our religion more special than any other religion is because we are given this tool to primarily directly connect with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala without any intermediary in the middle. So dua is to call to Allah, to communicate with Him. And one thing about dua is it combines all these different aspects like any other worship, where you're combining hub, khawf, and raja, where you're combining the love of Allah with the fear of Allah, with the hope in Allah. All three of these are being combined in one worship to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So you have to realize that when you think of dua as asking Allah for something that's correct, but also remember it's something beyond that. It's our primary way of connecting with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So make sure that dua is consistent to where you're constantly refreshing your relationship with Allah. Now, we're going to go through some steps. If you want to, I want you to visualize this before you write it down. You can write it down later. Can we go to the next slide? So we're going to go through these steps, okay? And I want you to think about these steps. I want you to remember these steps and work on these steps for the next 2 days. Number one is that you need to get inspired. And what does this mean to get inspired? You can see this on the right over here is what I'm talking about. If Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala offered you anything, right? Anything at all, it's an open book. What would you ask for? So think about what will you ask for when Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, if Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala offers you anything that you want. Be excited about your du'as, right? So if you are bored by the du'a that you're making, maybe you don't want it bad enough, right? So if you feel like your du'a has become routine, robotic, your heart is no longer in it, do you want it badly enough? So if your du'as have stop making you feel excited, change the wording of your du'a. Change the way you make du'a. Change your intention behind your du'a. So be excited about your du'a. Make them realistic enough, but not limited by your capabilities. What does that mean? That don't say something weird and abnormal, as in like supernatural, but make your du'as magnificent, right? Think about, if Allah, the one who has the most power, offered you anything, what is it that you would ask for? Connect your dua to both the world and the akhirah. So either you can do like half-half, or ask for something in this world that helps you with your akhirah, whatever it is. Connect them to both, right? Because when you make your dua, all your du'as are only about the akhirah, there's nothing wrong with that, but sometimes you start to feel disconnected from your own dua. So make your dua something tangible, something that you can feel. One example of this is a saying by Al-Hasan al-Basri, who said, who taught this dua for new parents, is that you ask for a child and you make, because the child becomes a reason to thank Allah. Right? So think about something you really want, right? You really want an A in this really hard class that you're taking, and you think about it in that, if I get an A, that's going to be a reason for me to thank Allah. Right? So you're connecting something very worldly with something more spiritual and bigger than that. Think about the ends and not the means. Now, what does this mean? Is that some advice I've heard before is from my teachers, is that you don't want to put a limitation or a specific amount, right, on the dua you're asking for. You want to make dua for the ends, right? So, for example, instead of making dua that You know, Ya Allah, let me lose this amount of weight. Make dua, Ya Allah, let me be able to run a marathon. Or let me be able to live a healthy lifestyle. Instead of making dua that, Ya Allah, this is how much money I want, make dua for the things that you're going to be using the money for. Or make dua that you're able to be rich enough to open a charity or something like that, right? So think about the ends of what you're going to be doing with what you're given rather than what you're being given itself. Both are okay, but you want to think about the bigger picture even in your du'as. And then also put a timeline. Now what does this mean? I'm not saying don't make dua that you're blessed with, you know, grandkids one day. I'm saying make dua for the things that look closer and are more tangible and are sooner in your timeline. So you want to be able to make dua for things that you have a desire to work towards. Does that make sense? So if you can't work towards it, then the dua feels less effective, right? So if you are a freshman right now, right? If you're in your first year of college and you're thinking about the job that you're going to get after you graduate, sure, that's a great thing to make dua for, and I'm not saying don't make dua for it, but focus on what's closer. And we're talking about specific goals here. We're not talking about the bigger picture. We're talking about specific goals. Focus on what's closer to you, the next 4 years of school. So you make dua that Allah makes these next 4 years of school easier for you. Make dua that you are able to take this and this and this class. You make dua for this and this grade. You make dua for these opportunities, for this internship. Think about the things that are closer to you in the next 3-4 years that you can actively work towards. Okay, so that's what it means to get inspired. Number 2 is to select, again, this is just for the project that we're working on. You can have hundreds and hundreds of du'as. I'm talking about a specific project that I want us to work on. Select 5 dream du'as, right? So think about 5, 4, 6, like a small number of du'a, right? And picture them individually. Think about them individually, right? So some du'as of ours like blur into one another. I want you to think about 5 distinct du'as. Ya Allah, I want this job. Ya Allah, I want to get married by this year. Ya Allah, I want to improve my friendship with this person. Whatever it is, think about 5 things that you want. Number 3 is internalize these du'as. If you don't know what you're asking for, right, how can you make dua for it? If you can't answer at any time, what are those 5 du'as? So you need to basically think about them individually, internalize them, know exactly what it is you're asking for. Number 4, picture your du'as visually. What does this mean? What does it look like when these du'as are accepted? Can you picture yourself how it looks exactly when these du'as are accepted? Right? So picture the answers to these du'as visually. Number 5, form dua habits. Know the times of accepted du'as. When are the times? During rain, during the time between Asr and Maghrib on Fridays, between the Iqamah and the Adhan and the Iqamah, whatever it is. There's multiple times, there's multiple opportunities where du'as are accepted. Now your du'as are not limited to those times, but those are times where your du'as are more likely to be accepted. Make a routine and make those du'as every single day. Right? Every single day, those du'as, you should be making them. Every single prayer, right? Before you go to bed, whenever it is, every single day you should be making those du'as. You should want them badly enough where you don't forget them and you read them every single day. And number 6, sandwich your du'a. Now what does this mean to sandwich your du'a? Start by praising Allah and calling Allah by the names that relate to the du'a that you're making. Then do salawat on the Prophet, Allahumma salli wa sallim ala nabiyyina Muhammad. Then make the dua that you want, then praise the Prophet again, and then praise Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Okay? So sandwich your du'as in between praise of Allah and then salawat of the Prophet and then the dua that you're making, and that basically increases the quality of your dua. So when you have these steps, right, at the end of this talk or before you go to bed tonight, I want you to open your notes on your phone and I want you to write down these 5 du'as that I mentioned, these that you're thinking of, these dream du'as. Things that you can work on for the next 3-4 years, things that you can picture yourself visually attaining these du'as, and things that you can make a habit of making dua of every single day. Now, I forgot to clarify some misconceptions. Some misconceptions about dua. Dua doesn't have to be formal, right? It doesn't need to be structured. Now, if you're sandwiching your dua, it makes the quality better, but you don't have to do it. You don't have to be sitting in a specific area, or it has to be a specific time of the day. Dua can be anything at any time, okay? It doesn't have to be formal. You don't have to have your hijab on, you don't have to have wudu when you're making dua. Unlike prayer, dua can be done in any state at any time. You don't have to face the qibla or be sitting down when you're making dua. Your dua can be in any language, even in your prayer, right? So if you don't speak Arabic and in your sajda after you read Subhana Rabbiyal A'la, then you can make dua in any language, even in your 5 prayers, even in your 5 daily prayers. And again, prayer is not the only time for making dua. Although it is a great time to make dua, it's not the only time to make dua. Okay? So with that, I ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to make us from those people whose du'as are accepted. I ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to make us from those people who make dua when we have the yaqeen, the trust that Allah will answer them. I ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to accept all the dua that we make and the dua that we forget to make. I ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to make us from those whose dua is accepted, whether in this life or the next. I think we have Q&A, right? Do we have a code? Where's Mehtan? I don't see it. Okay. Do we have a QR code for the Q&A, or you don't know? Okay. Okay, let's do audience Q&A in the meantime. Yes.
So first question, two questions. Number one, is it like preferred to make dua in like Arabic, or is it like there's no preference?
Not at all. There's no favor in language when it comes to dua.
And then number two is like, I know you talked about in the beginning like that condition, like how like some people are conditioned to make dua in like only times of hardship.
Mm-hmm.
And like how do you have like any like advice on how to turn to Allah in like times of ease,
Mm-hmm.
like when things are going well?
Yeah. Yeah, so think about, there's multiple ways to address this. Number one, if something bad is happening in your life, something difficult is happening in your life, and that difficult thing goes away, then make dua by thanking Allah for removing that difficulty, right? Or if you were making dua for something you really wanted and you got it, then constantly remember Allah by making dua, thanking Allah, right? So for example, I was really praying to get into a university, for example, right? And I was praying for it, and it was easy to pray for it because I really wanted it. Now, once I get it, right, I shouldn't stop at thanking Allah for giving it to me in the first place, right? So thank Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala for what He gave you. Number two is anticipate the hardships that will come to you. So think about when things will be hard, when things will be difficult, and ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala in that moment, give me patience for when things are difficult, or save me from these difficulties. Ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala for things to do in the hereafter when things are easy, right? So ask Allah for Jannah, ask Allah for His pleasure, ask Allah to save you from His punishment, ask for things to do with that. The point is that you're not always asking for things, but you're always remembering Allah whether things are easy or hard. So if you're waking up for tahajjud when things are really hard, don't stop waking up for tahajjud when things are easy. If you're praying your sunnahs when things are really hard, don't stop praying your sunnahs when things are easy, right? It's okay for us to be doing a little more, a little extra when we really need Allah. That's why we're advised to do more when we're easy, because it's human nature to do extra when we feel like when we're going through something hard, right? So if you feel like you're that kind of person who only turns to Allah when things are hard, that's not abnormal, that's natural. You have to actively train yourself to turn to Allah when things are easy. It is harder than the other way. Questions? Yeah.
I also have a couple questions. Is there anything specific that we're taught to say or do when we notice the dua is being answered?
Just to thank Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So there's not a specific like routine, but you just thank Allah when the dua is being answered.
Okay. And then the second question is, I believe there's a hadith qudsi that says that Allah descends to the lowest heaven in the late hours of the night.
Yeah.
Do you still also reap those benefits if you did not wake up for tahajjud but you're already up late, like up late studying or something? Can I still like pray 2 rak'ahs and then make dua with the intention of having Allah like give you the benefits of tahajjud or
Yeah, so a condition to it is not waking up from sleep, right? So if you're awake in the last of the night, your tahajjud still has that same benefit. The only thing I would say is that the harder something is, the more reward you're getting for it. That's the only difference. So it's harder to wake up from your sleep to pray than it is if you're already awake. But that doesn't mean your tahajjud means less. It just means that other person's getting more reward because they're doing something harder. Does that make sense? So like for 2 people wearing the hijab, if the hijab looks exactly on both of them, but it's harder for one of them, they're getting more ajr because it's harder for them. Does that make sense? Mm-hmm. Any other questions? Mehtan, do we have the QR code? No, you don't? Okay, so are we not doing a QR code? You guys ask your questions? Does anyone want a QR code? I guess that's going to expose, no one's going to say yes. Yeah. Yes, Yusra.
So how do you know when Allah might be angry with us? Because obviously like you're just saying like if your dua is not answered, then it's not Allah's angry.
Mm-hmm.
But how do you know if Allah, or like can we even know if
you can't technically know if Allah is not pleased with you. But also keep in mind, if you're the kind of person worried about that, right? Why would Allah not be pleased with you? Does that make sense? The kind of people Allah is not pleased with are the kind of people that don't care. So when you're in that active state of worrying about if Allah loves you or not, if Allah is pleased with you or not, you're more likely to be in the box that because you care, it's like a cycle, right? It's like a good cycle where because you care, it shows that Allah cares for you, and because Allah cares for you, you care. Does that make sense? Just like when you love Allah, Allah loves you. If Allah loves you, you love Allah. It's a cycle. So it's not transactional how we think it is. So the fact that you're in a position where you're worried about it, it's most likely showing that you're putting in the effort for Allah to not be displeased with you. Because Allah's anger, whenever it's referred to in the Quran, it's extreme, very severe things. Right? Where is Allah's anger mentioned when someone kills someone? Right? If you're not killing anyone, then why would Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala be displeased with you? You would have to have extreme levels of disbelief, of sinning, of carelessness, of lack of taqwa, lack of God consciousness, all those kind of things for there to be a level where Allah is angry with someone. Okay, does that answer the question? Someone else had their hand up? Yeah. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
I don't know if that's a thing, but really want to take back the dua.
I think that's thinking of things too transactionally again. This is Allah you're talking to. So if Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala will even answer the unspoken things in your dua. So if you're making dua for 1, 2, 3, 4 and you forgot to ask for 5, that will still be referred to. So there's no such thing as an inevitable dua. You make the dua and you change your mind, you can make dua for something else. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
So how do you know, or like, so do you just keep making the dua indefinitely,
Mm-hmm.
even if it's not like manifesting, like no promises being made towards that dua that you're making, or is there a point where it's just like, okay, maybe like it is something?
It depends what you're making dua for, right? So, I mean, if you're making dua for a job and that company shuts down, you're not going to be making dua for that job anymore, right? So it's you want to keep making the dua indefinitely as long as it makes sense to. Logically makes sense to keep making the dua because you're not losing anything. Like every time you make dua, not only are you getting what you asked for, kind of, but you're also getting good deeds for asking. You know, so there's ajr involved and then there's the answer of the dua involved. So yes, we should keep making dua indefinitely. Yeah. A dua is a call to Allah. So it could be supplication, it could be prayer, it could be asking Allah for something. Both. It's both. So it's if you're asking God for something, or you're praising God, or you're just talking to God. It could even be you just complaining about your problems to God. All of those come under the category of dua. Now, specifically, I think most of what we're talking about today has to do with a request. Right? But we don't think of it in terms of requests, we just think of it in terms of talking to God about your needs. Did that answer the question? Okay. Are there any questions on the QR code? Yeah, I got it. How do you deal with losing hope and having fatigue when you've been asking for something for years and you haven't gotten it? Now, there's two aspects to this. Number one, this aspect of losing hope, right? I forgot the Arabic word for it. Despair. Anyone know the Arabic word for despair? Yes, لا تيأسوا من روح الله, right? So we are told specifically that we should not have despair or lose hope in the mercy of Allah, and this by definition also goes to dua, right? So you should not lose hope. Now, if you're talking specifically about losing hope in the thing you're asking for, right? it again depends on what is you're asking for, and there's a great deal of like logic that applies to this. If you've been asking, I know I keep giving the same examples over and over, but those are the easiest examples to give. But if you've been asking for 4 or 5 years that Allah helps you get married, and you still haven't gotten married, no, don't stop asking, right? Because it was when you've been this is something that people have different timelines for. This is something that everyone has nasib for. This is something that is not time bound, right? Like, but if you've been asking to, get the specific work position and you've outgrown that position, then move on to something else, right? Because that may not have been the right thing for you. Or if you've been asking, I can't think of other examples, but I want you to think about what you're asking for and then in relation to who you're asking, right? So nothing is impossible for Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, but you have to think about what makes sense for you in your timeline, where you are in your life, what kind of thing is it that you're asking for, and don't lose hope and don't have fatigue because you're doing a good deed, right? It's not like you're asking a person for a favor over and over and you're tired of their response of saying no. You're asking Allah for something. So if Allah is not answering your dua, it could be because Allah wants to give you more good deeds every time you ask this dua, and Allah knows if you get what you want, you'll stop talking to Allah or something like that. So no, don't let that making dua fatigue you. Don't let yourself lose hope. Keep asking for what it is you're asking for, as long as it makes sense for where you are in your life. How do you know if your dua is not being answered because it's not the right time, or if there's something better? You don't, right? This comes with trust in Allah, right? And again, it depends on what you're asking for. So if you're asking for, I can't think of an example, but whatever it is you're asking for, you will get an answer, and if the answer is not yes immediately, then it's either going to come to you later or you're going to get something better. So you have no choice but to trust in Allah, because you don't know what the outcome is until it happens, right? Let's see. How effective is consistent dua? I'm not sure what that question means. Dua is effective, and the more you do it, the more effective it is, like any other good deed, right? So the more you pray, the more reward you get. The more dua you do, the more likely your dua will be accepted. So yes, keep making dua. Consistent dua is a sign of higher iman. You've seen opportunities open that you've made dua for. How do you go about it when these opportunities have opened? Just like anything else, right? In the end, dua does not mean you sit back and do nothing. If you've seen something open up for what you've made dua for, then you have to pursue it. You have to do what's in your hands for a dua to be accepted. You can't just sit back and do nothing. How do you not get bored when making dua for the afterlife? This is a good question. How do you not get bored when making dua for the afterlife? Don't make your du'as copy-paste, if that makes sense. So instead of making dua, Ya Allah, take me to Jannatul Firdaus, think about who you're going to be neighbors with. Ya Allah, make me neighbors with your favorite prophet or something. Think about the kind of house you want. Ya Allah, let me have this kind of house in Jannah. Think about the kind of things that you wish for in Jannah that you won't be able to do in this world. Imagine them, picture them visually as best as you can. Think about, the kinds of luxuries are in Jannah, and make dua for those specific things. So for example, Ya Allah, let me go to Jannatul Firdaus and be neighbors with the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam. Ya Allah, let these friends come with me. Ya Allah, let this be something that I enjoy, whatever it is. When you're talking about saving you from Allah's punishment, think about the punishments, right? Think about the kind of pain of punishment. Think about the worst pain you've ever experienced, and think about something worse. Think about people you've known who have lost someone close to them, or whatever we see in news all the time about. We see death all around us in the news. Imagine that. Imagine things more realistically. Picture them visually for you to be able to not become bored with your dua. This is an interesting question. I've heard scholars and friends say that du'as may not be going through or accepted if we are not eating zabiha. There's a lot of layers to this question, which contradicts from what you mentioned about Allah being unhappy with you. Can we get some clarification on that? When we say that, okay, I'm not going to go into the zabiha thing, because realize that the people who are not eating zabiha don't think they're eating it. This is a whole other debate. But when someone's not eating zabiha, it's not because they think the food is haram, it's because they think the food's halal. It's just very, very annoying misconceptions from the UK Muslims on Twitter where we all think we're eating haram food, so when we go to Chick-fil-A or In-N-Out or something, we're only eating it because there's no alternatives. But that's not the case. That's because we accept the opinions of the teachers who say that it is zabiha because it's from in a majority Christian country. Anyways, we're not going to go into that. The point is, if you feel like your dua is not being accepted because of a sin, not zabiha, something else, right? A sin that you're doing. Now, this does not mean that Allah is not giving you what you want because you're sinning. It means that Allah is delaying the answer to your dua so you stop the sin. Does that make sense? There's a difference. Right? So it could be that you're not getting what you want because by stopping the bad that you're doing, that will facilitate what you want. So that could be the reason that Allah is delaying the answer to your dua. Does that make sense? Does that answer the question? So if you feel like a sin is coming in the way for dua being accepted, then that's because Allah is using that thing, right, that you are asking for as a way to stop you from doing haram, and to sorry, I saw another question. To stop you from doing haram and to get closer to Allah. Does dua still count when you have low iman and are less sincere? No, those are two different things. When you have low iman, yes, dua counts. If you are less sincere, your dua has to be sincere. Like that's a primary thing for it to be accepted. Now, what does it mean to be sincere? It means that you know Allah is capable of whatever you're asking for, that you trust Allah will answer it, that you trust if it's not good for you, then Allah will delay it, whatever it is. You're trusting the outcome of the dua and you're leaving that to Allah, right? That's what sincerity means. You don't have to be a specific level of piety to make dua. Shaitan made dua and it's accepted, right? So if the worst of all creations can make dua and it will be accepted, then you don't have to be a certain level of good to make dua. Can I make dua that I become someone whose du'as get accepted? Of course. We always ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to make us from those whose du'as get accepted. As long as you're asking for something halal, you can ask for it. Can you make du'as in English in sujood and fard salah? Yes, you can. There's a minor opinion you can't, but the majority opinion is that yes, you can. Whether it's fard salah or sunnah salah, as long as you're reading the main du'as in Arabic, then the specific dua that you're asking for can be in any language. Is it okay to make dua for someone you want to marry to accept Islam? Yes, you're asking for something halal and you're asking for something good. Nothing wrong with that. Again, you can make dua for anything as long as it's not something haram. Right? So, if you are, as a Muslim woman, are making dua that you get to marry a Christian man, right, without him converting, then that dua does not make sense because you're asking for something that's not allowed, right? But if you make dua that that person converts and you get to marry them, then there's nothing wrong with that dua. Someone wants to talk on food and zabiha food. Well, maybe we'll do that. I think that's it. Okay, I think that's it. So I ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to make us all people whose du'as are accepted. I ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to make us from those who consistently make dua to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. ربنا آتنا في الدنيا حسنة وفي الآخرة حسنة وقنا عذاب النار وصلى اللهم وسلم على نبينا محمد وعلى آله وصحبه وسلم. جزاكم الله خير. السلام عليكم.